The closing arguments in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, which are set to start in just about an hour. The trial is drawing all eyes to Minneapolis to see whether or not the jury will hold the former police officer responsible for the death of George Floyd. The prosecution called several witnesses, including some of Chauvin's former colleagues. They called Chauvin's actions unreasonable.
If your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
The defense blamed Floyd's drug use and heart issues for his death. The guilty verdict would have to be, of course, unanimous, so the defense only needs that one juror to doubt that Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck killed him. Jamie Yuccas is joining us now. She has covered the trial from the very beginning from Minneapolis. Jamie, how is the city preparing for this verdict? Specifically, what kind of security are you seeing? What's the posture of police?
Well, we've seen a lot more National Guard troops on the streets here in downtown Minneapolis, and they are throughout the city itself. We were told about 3,000 National Guard troops are actually in the city to try to quell any tension or violence that could pop up. There's about 4,000 law enforcement total, and we know that the governor actually asked for help from neighboring states to have some law enforcement come in and help out in terms of security. Concerns growing that there could be tension depending on which way this verdict goes. I can also tell you that Minneapolis public schools, in a rare move, decided that kids would go to school in class today and tomorrow, but starting on Wednesday, they will do remote learning in anticipation of a verdict. Now, you might wonder the timing on that because, of course, closing arguments are today. I can tell you we will have the closing arguments this morning. From what I've been told is that, you'll have the prosecution go first. They are expected to go between an hour, hour and a half. You'll have the defense, who will probably go about the same amount of time. Then there's a rebuttal. So we'll have that. The closing arguments take much of the morning. But by this afternoon, the case will be in the jurors' hands. The judge will have to go over some instructions. A foreperson will have to be picked, and then they will be sequestered. They'll be taken to a hotel where they can start deliberations. But from what we've been hearing, there's been varying reports as to when the judge will cut off deliberations each evening. Of course, we're in the central time zone here, so we've heard anything from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock. The judge wanting to make sure that a verdict doesn't come in at night. If it comes beyond 7 p.m., the judge has said that he will not release it until the next morning because there is so much concern about potential violence.
So you sort of took us through kind of the timeline for the day, but we know that before deliberations even start, the judge will have to give the jury some instructions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, he's going to have to go through and tell them specifically, what they're responsible for and how long it could take. They're going to have to go through each charge, and he's going to have to lay out, the second-degree murder charge, what that means, if it's intentional, unintentional, he'll lay through that. Then the third-degree murder charge, which, as you recall, was just recently reinstated in this case after the judge had removed it earlier in the trial. It came back because of a Supreme Court ruling. So he'll have to go through what that charge means, and then the second-degree manslaughter charge. He'll then tell them, that they're able to relook at pieces of evidence. Because of coronavirus, they have loaded a laptop, it looks like, with all the pieces of evidence. The jury will have to still let the courtroom know that it's looking at certain pieces of evidence, but you won't have that whole back and forth of bringing a tape or bringing something to the jury back and forth. It'll all be loaded right there for them to take a look. So he's going to move through all that and then let them know that they all have to have a consensus. It has to be unanimous if they decide that they're going to convict on a certain charge. So he'll have to lay through that, and then he'll take them, and they will be sequestered, as I said, and they'll start their deliberations.
Jamie, one question that I have, I know you've been talking to folks on the ground there. You've been talking to people who have been demonstrating throughout the course of this trial. If the verdict comes back and it is guilty, for example, let's say it's guilty on all counts, what are people telling you about what they will do, how they will react? I think we get a sense of how it could go if the verdict comes back that he is acquitted, but I'm curious, what are you hearing about some folks and what they're telling you should he be convicted?
There's still concern, Vlad, especially since this is an area where you have the city, but then you have outlying areas in rural counties that are much more conservative, and you have a number of people who align themselves with white supremacist type of groups. So there is concern that there are people associated with some of these groups that could come into the city to back the blue, as we've heard, before in different instances. When the riots originally happened here back last May, there were some Bugaloo boys, part of a white supremacist group, who actually came to the area and were spotted, and a couple of them were arrested after they were seen trying to light certain businesses and things on fire. So that happened in the original riots. There is concern that maybe that could potentially happen again. We just don't know. Obviously, there's cause for concern on all sides, especially since just a few miles away you had the Brooklyn Center incident with Dante Wright happen just a week ago, and you've seen the protests and things happen there. There's a lot of tension between the protesters and law enforcement. Even on Friday night, some journalists were detained, and the governor had to step in over the weekend and say that's not going to happen again, that if they're wearing a media badge, that law enforcement is not going to detain them or arrest them, that they will be left alone. But there's been clashes between law enforcement and journalists over the last several days. So there's just a lot of anxiety, I can tell you. There's a number of media here in the area that I'm located just by the government center, and all of us were talking this morning just about how we don't know. The human species is a very unpredictable species, and so not only do we not know how the jury is going to react, we don't know how protesters are going to react, but there is definitely a lot of tension and concern just on all sides as to how this could play out.
Yeah, and it's not just where you are. All cities across the country are sort of preparing for reaction either way, whichever way the verdict goes. Jamie, thank you so much.